Game of Thrones Season 8, Episode 6, The Iron Throne. Hello and welcome to Hoeg's Postmortem analysis of the very final episode of HBO's Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones Season 8, Episode 6, The Iron Throne. Honestly, I'd expected a title that was a bit more poetic than The Iron Throne, wouldn't you? In any event, if this is your first time in my postmortems, please note these are filled with spoilers. Postmortem meaning after I have watched something or played something in the case of a video game or read something in the case of a book. So, I gave a spoiler warning at the start of this video. There was a spoiler siren. If you haven't seen the episode yet, if you care about it, please wait. Please come back after you've seen it, and then we can talk all about it. Everyone else, let's talk about it right now. I started out by saying I thought there would be a more poetic title for this episode. Honestly, The Iron Throne isn't a terribly good name for the episode, especially given the fact that The Iron Throne doesn't itself make it more than, I don't know, maybe a half hour into the episode due to the actions of Drogon, our favorite dragon. But leaving that aside for just a moment, I suppose the title relates to who sits the Iron Throne, or at least who is the leader of the 7, now 6 kingdoms at the end of the episode. And certainly that's going to be a topic that we have to discuss. The fact that Bran, of all people, finally sits the throne and rules the 6 kingdoms of man is unexpected in the overall structure of the story. Although if you were here for my postmortem on episode 5, you know that I had basically come down to either Sansa or Bran leading the charge for the throne because, frankly, there aren't a lot of good options if, as I thought would happen, Jon effectively takes himself out of the running by doing what needed to be done against Daenerys, and certainly that happened in this episode as well. So I think at the end of the day, given where the pieces were on the chessboard at the end of episode 5, this episode made as much sense as any other this season. Unfortunately, that's not a whole heck of a lot of sense. And so before we start to get into it on a scene-by-scene basis, I did want to give my overall thoughts. I will tell you a little story before I start. After I put out my postmortem video for episode 5, The Bells, the episode where Dany turns and goes nuts on King's Landing, I got invited out to lunch with my parents, who have been following Game of Thrones since the very first season and have been relatively normalized in terms of their response to the episode. It's a television show that they enjoy, but they watch these episodes like most other people, and they have certain thoughts, but they don't necessarily get agitated or in love with any particular plotline. And they took me out to lunch on Monday, and they had watched my postmortem video, and they essentially said, "You went too light on the show. We expected you to be a lot angrier based on the narrative structure and what happened and what they did to Daenerys and everything else." So we actually wound up having a long lunch on that Monday, and they explained to me at length for an hour or more exactly what I got wrong and how I was being too nice to the show, which if you listen to that episode, you might find surprising because I wasn't overly nice about what they wound up doing in that episode. I even called the show as wearing a skin suit of the better earlier seasons and really kind of diving headlong into a pool of nihilism, which I didn't particularly enjoy as a storytelling method. But with that understood, I think they'll probably be happier when they wind up listening to this episode because this was a train wreck. This was the tire fire that we thought it might be after watching the rest of the season, after talking about the structural issues that had been imposed on the show from their getting rid of the Night King and the White Walker threat, dispatching with it as easily as they did, and finally resulting in what amounted to a non-battle against Cersei and her pirate boy toy Euron, and really just having Dany turn on a dime, flip a switch, go crazy, and start killing innocents for really no strategic reason, and no reason that is very well explained in the show. We went over that at length when we talked about episode 5, but here in episode 6, the finale, the grand finale of Game of Thrones, we're really left dealing with the aftermath of those choices. And at this point in time, with the Night King dispatched, with no zombie threat, with a crazy Daenerys on the throne, there wasn't a whole heck of a lot that anybody could do. I had said last week that I thought Jon basically had to kill Dany at this point, and that if he did that, essentially the plot lines of both major characters, the main two characters of Game of Thrones, the ones that we had been following for seasons and for years, both plot lines really wouldn't be very satisfying in any way that I could imagine. And watching this episode tonight, I have to say they weren't satisfying. You had Dany say very little in this episode before she's killed by Jon. And then you had Jon say very little, not much more than he said for the rest of the season, but you really don't get into his brain space. You really don't get to figure out what he's about. And we're going to get to it when we talk about the final fates of these characters, but they don't give him the agency that I think his character has earned to even decide one little bit about his fate. He really gets a raw deal at the end of this episode, or so it would seem by the way they structured it. I don't know if it's actually a raw deal, because I think there's a way you could have framed it where he's actually pretty much okay with his end result, but they don't show that in the episode. And by comparison, other characters who did a lot worse, had a lot more bad acts, didn't have the same kind of impact on the storyline that Jon did, or Dany did, frankly, have much better results. And maybe that's part of George R.R. Martin's story. Maybe that's part of the bullet points that he gave to the HBO showrunners, Benioff and Weiss. But it doesn't make for necessarily a very compelling saga. It doesn't make for a plot line that you want to return to and really revel in, because at the end of the day, all of these endpoints seem almost random. And certainly when we talk about nihilism, as we did in the last episode's analysis, that's what really rings true for me. Nobody gets their justice. Nobody gets their just desserts. Grey Worm wanders off to wherever he goes to after being really a war criminal in my eyes, and we're going to talk about that a little bit as well. And good people get bad results, bad people get good results, and maybe that's the point. But if that's the point, it's not one that I find overly satisfying, and it's not a story I find overly compelling to have watched or to have read. Now, I said when I looked at episode 5, when I looked at a lot of these episodes this season, I strongly suspect, even if the major plot points remain the same in the Song of Ice and Fire books, that they will be gotten to more organically, that the characterizations will make more sense, that the plot lines will make more sense. Some of that is just the nature of books versus television. If you've got 1,000 pages to explain somebody's mental state, and you can talk about somebody's mental state directly, that's often going to be more effective for the kind of story that Game of Thrones is, or in this case, A Song of Ice and Fire is, than just looking at an actor kind of trying to portray mental states, which they had a lot of difficulty doing with the dialogue and the writing that they were given in this season 6. And so that's kind of the overview of my feelings on the episode. I really did think it was bad. I really did think it was disappointing. And overall, it kind of does put a little bit of hurt in your gut that this show that you'd watched for 10 years, that did have a lot of highs, had some lows in the middle there, but really, really fell down, really tripped before the finish line in these last two seasons, season 7 and season 8. And really, these characters that we watched tonight and we watched for the last 5 weeks were hollow shells. They were robotic automatons of the characters we had known and grew to love over these years. And that's a shame. It's one of those cases where you had something that you loved, it didn't hit its mark, it didn't stick the landing. And I don't blame anybody necessarily. I don't think that the writers did a very good job this season, but it might be a very, very, very difficult task. Obviously, George R.R. Martin himself is having difficulty bringing his story home. So the fact that television show writers that maybe don't have his breadth of knowledge of these characters or the world had an equal or greater amount of challenge isn't unexpected. And maybe we put too much on them for the problems that they had. But they had problems all the same. And frankly, it just winds up feeling disappointing when you get to the end of the episode, when you get to the end of the series, and you realize you spent all this time on a story that at the end of the day didn't make a ton of sense. And I think that's really the greatest kind of insult or disparagement I can level at a show or at a story. And certainly we're going to talk a little bit about the Tyrion lines that they put into this episode that, of course, are written by a writer, or else they wouldn't be said, and talk about the power of great stories, because, frankly, I always hate it when writers put that kind of language in their own works, because it always seems self-aggrandizing. It always seems to be backslapping, and certainly in this show in particular, in this series, when all of this has gone so wrong, when this has become such soured milk. It was quite, not offensive. Offensive might be too strong a word, but it was a bit much to hear those words coming out of Tyrion's mouth in that particular scene, and we're going to get to that. But overall, I did think it was a disappointment. I had hoped they could pull out of the slide at some point here in the last couple episodes. Unfortunately, I really do think the Battle of Winterfell, what they decided to do with the White Walkers and the Night King, was the point of no return. They never really recovered, and episodes 4, 5, and 6 are best left to the memories of Bran somewhere in the distance, where he says nothing but cryptic fortune cookie sayings to even intimate what might have happened in these episodes. So that's where we left off. So let's talk about the scenes. We're going to talk about them in order, like we did in the earlier postmortems of this series, and then afterwards we're going to talk about a few conclusions. We're going to talk about the final fates of the characters, and maybe just a brief conclusory thought about the series on the whole. Obviously, I'm sitting here just after watching the episode, disappointed in the end result. I don't know whether you are. If you're not, please share that with me. Share with me what you liked about the episode, what really worked for you, and what didn't. And if you are disappointed, talk to me about that as well, because obviously I'm just one voice on this, and while I think I have a pretty good handle on storytelling and what worked and what didn't work in this episode and with other TV shows and movies, certainly different people are going to have different opinions. Reasonable minds can differ, and your mileage may vary. Like all other episodes of Game of Thrones, this had some good music. It had some good visuals, although I think a couple of them were a little bit too cute, and we'll talk about those as well. But overall, that doesn't get you to a good story. Ultimately, the plot, the characterization, those things matter. And those have gone by the wayside for a number of episodes now, really since the end of season 6, in my opinion, although different people are going to have different opinions as to when that happened. So let's talk about the very start of the episode. So we knew going in this was going to be a supersized episode. I think it's about 80 minutes long. But at the very start, we get Tyrion walking and walking and walking. We get 3 minutes of Tyrion walking, and I said to my friends who were watching the episode with me, I said, this feels like they're stretching for time. That doesn't make any sense, obviously, because they have all the time that they want. They could have made this 2 episodes if they felt the need. HBO would have funded another season if they wanted it. But this felt like they didn't have enough plot. They didn't have enough storytelling. And this feeling really permeated the whole last season. There are a lot of scenes that I can point to where you have this elongated action. And in this case, it's just Tyrion walking through King's Landing. And you can talk about the artistic sensibilities of it, that you want to show the carnage, you want to show the damage. I think that was pretty well done at the end of episode 5. But even if you want to allow it, 3 minutes is a ridiculously long time to just watch someone walk through a location in silence. And he gets 3 minutes. We're going to put a little counter on this because there are a number of Tyrion slowly does something scenes in this episode, and they count up to almost a quarter of the running time of the episode of really just watching Tyrion, not even necessarily saying anything, but really just watching him walk or be told things and things of that nature. After we see Tyrion slow walk through King's Landing, we come upon Grey Worm executing Lannisters who had surrendered, and Jon having a significant problem with that. As you might expect, we saw in episode 5 that Jon was fighting against the murderous impulses of both the Northmen and the Unsullied that made up Dany's army, and was fighting a losing battle. He did lose that battle. They went nuts on King's Landing, and here he comes upon Grey Worm executing Lannisters, and Jon's upset. And he's convinced to go talk to Dany about this, understanding that that's going to result in the Lannister army being murdered by Grey Worm. And that's the last we really see of that scene. We get a mention of that later on when Jon talks to Dany about it. But I think right now we'll take a step back because Grey Worm here is acting under his queen's orders, absolutely, although he wasn't in the last episode. But by murdering these people after they've surrendered, after they are his prisoners, by murdering people last week, in my opinion, watching Grey Worm's actions here, they are done out of rage from Missandei's death. And he's a war criminal. He's acting outside the bounds of justified battle. He's acting with murderous impulses, allowing people to rape and pillage through King's Landing. And we can talk about whether that's the norm for how battles are conducted in Westeros or Essos. I think it's unclear, but certainly from the way it was portrayed last episode, I put Grey Worm in the bucket with Daenerys having committed these terrorist acts on King's Landing. So when we get to these later scenes in this episode, I have a real problem with the people of Westeros giving Grey Worm this position of seeking justice, of being this model of justice that is causing all these problems for both Tyrion and Jon Snow, who wind up really saving the realm from a tyrannical queen. And they give Grey Worm all of this ability to cause these problems with really one throwaway line from Davos later on that says, hey, I acknowledge that you helped us fight off the White Walkers, and that's a debt we can't repay. But that was a debt that Dany paid as well, and they were certainly on board. Tyrion and Arya certainly were on board with Jon Snow assassinating her to save the realms of men, as it were. And to me, Grey Worm should not be placed outside that bucket, so it's a surprise how he's treated in this episode. It's certainly a surprise where his ending is, because the Westerosi leaders, the lords and ladies, don't wind up doing anything about it, don't wind up doing anything to him. And he's just seen really through the episode's lens as a kind of sympathetic figure, even though he's just as bad as Dany, following the orders of someone that is evil. And certainly relishing in that evil in the last episode. So I had a real problem with that. I had a real problem with Grey Worm's turn, just as I did with Dany's, by the way. I don't know that either of them in the previous seasons that we had followed them showed that this would be what would happen in this kind of scenario, and so it came out of nowhere. Grey Worm's anger came out of nowhere as well, though he never had lost somebody like Missandei before, so at least it's somewhat justified for what happens last episode. But he's not treated that way, so the episode expects us to just accept that Grey Worm is justified in his requests, and or they don't want to have a war with the Unsullied. It's a little bit unclear, but that's where we're left with Grey Worm. Tyrion then continues walking. We go back to Tyrion. We had a 3-minute scene to open with Tyrion. We had the Grey Worm scene, and now we have Tyrion walking through the underground passages of the Red Keep, ultimately to find Jaime and Cersei. This sequence, where there's very little dialogue, it's really only whimpering from Peter Dinklage, takes up more than 5 minutes of time. So in the first little stint of this episode, we've got 8+ minutes of Tyrion walking, Tyrion climbing, Tyrion looking, Tyrion crying, Tyrion moving bricks. And it's really quite incredible because, at least for me, who was invested, was interested in seeing this series finale episode of Game of Thrones, it immediately took me out of the episode. It immediately felt like someone trying to turn in a paper at the end of midterms by changing the margins, increasing the font size, and stretching to make this stuff seem more important or bigger than it might otherwise be, and that they probably didn't have a lot of story to tell or a lot of plot to give, and that would be the case other than the bullet points for where everybody winds up. And so I already had my eyebrows raised and was a little suspicious about the way this episode was going right from the start. And of course, the scene, this 5-minute plus scene of Tyrion walking through the underground passages, includes a bunch of ridiculous stuff. There's a tiny passage up above this mountain of rocks, which is implied Tyrion crawls through, but we never see him do it because it would obviously look silly to actually show, and he's never dusty or otherwise shown as having walked through that kind of ridiculous passage. And then ultimately, the way he finds Jaime and Cersei is by finding Jaime's golden hand. And I think this is really the first instance in the episode where you get this kind of really on-the-nose imagery. Really feels like kind of an English lit set of imagery or a high school art project video of some kind where you get, oh yeah, his golden hand. That's what Tyrion finds in the pile of rubble. And oh, by the way, Cersei and Jaime died kind of clutching each other and under only one layer of bricks so that Tyrion could get them out of there. And, you know, I will suspend disbelief. This is all fine for the art that you want to put up there, the television show that you want to make. But these kinds of images, this on-the-nose kind of storytelling, persists throughout the rest of the episode. The whole golden hand thing is really only the first instance of this. And so I point it out here because I'm going to point it out in a couple of other places, but it really does start to grate. I think one thing that happens here, taking a step back, just talking about the art of storytelling, TV making, movie making, video game making, I do think there is a circumstance where if you're really enjoying the story, if you're loving the characters, if you're loving the plot, the storytellers can get away with a lot more of this kind of thing. This kind of on-the-nose imagery, coincidences in the way people meet up, things of that nature. And when you start to dislike the story, when it starts to not work for you, everything that is a part of making a television show, about making a story, winds up getting a little bit annoying, a little bit problematic. In the same way that maybe when you're in a relationship and it just starts to sour a little bit, those things that were once cute or ingratiating wind up being themselves annoying or problematic in your relationship partner. And so I think that does wind up happening. So Game of Thrones lost me this season. Truthfully, it started to lose me last season, and I was hoping that this season would make up for it. But at this point in time, sitting down to watch this episode, I really thought they really didn't have much of a chance of bringing it back. And so when there's these long sequences of Tyrion walking, when there is this golden hand in the rubble, I really honestly laughed. I will be entirely honest with you. I was sitting in a room with my friends watching this episode, and I just laughed because it was so ridiculous, so on the nose, felt like a Xena warrior princess type moment. And that's really what the show has become in the last 2 seasons. I said to my wife when I was watching season 7, and I believe it was the season where the Magnificent Seven go north of the wall and they fight with the dragons, and they lose the one dragon to the Zombie King and everything else, that the show had slowly become the stupidest thing that I enjoy, because I otherwise try to enjoy smart television, smart movies. It's not always the case. I think everybody likes something that maybe is a little bit not smart, as the case may be. But Game of Thrones had slowly slipped down the spectrum to the kind of reality TV levels. And while there was still stuff to enjoy about seeing a dragon attack a loot train or seeing a zombie dragon raised from the ice, it really was, in all honesty, stupid. And at this point, in the series finale, at the end of season 8, the whole thing was stupid. And the golden hand was just the symbol of that. And I couldn't help but laugh when I saw it. So that's my state of mind all of 10 minutes into this series finale as we go on through the scenes. So the next scene after Tyrion cries over his dead brother and sister is Arya inexplicably showing up to see the Dothraki running around in front of the Red Keep. Now, interestingly, we talk about timing in the show and how everybody's warping around Westeros. This is just a weird one because the last time we saw Arya, she was leaving town on a horse, and now she's back in town without a horse, and it just doesn't seem to match continuity. This is another one of those areas where you say, well, once the show has lost you, it becomes clearer and clearer when the showrunners or the people in charge, who aren't showrunners maybe, just don't really care about making all this stuff match up perfectly to make a cogent, coherent story. And so Arya just shows back up because the horse doesn't matter. Where she was doesn't really matter, and it doesn't for the plot and the story of this episode. But it's just another one of those things that goes in the back of your head and you say, well, okay, I guess Arya's back. I don't know why they showed her leaving because she was already in town and she could have just stayed in town, but she's back, and she's back to watch Dany give the evil Empress speech, which is the same one that Jon walks up to watch as well. And that's where we first see some cool imagery with the Unsullied pounding their sticks in front of her, with the Dothraki kind of running around on their horses, with the entirely broken Red Keep covered in ash, and with the world's largest Targaryen dragon flag covering the left-hand side of the keep. Honestly, where did they get that flag? Did they bring it from Essos? Was it covering a tent somewhere? It is a ridiculously enormous flag. If you're familiar with video games and video game marketing, it looked bigger than one of those advertisements they use to kind of frame an entire building next to the E3 Expo when they're advertising video games. It is the largest flag I think I have ever seen. And it looked cool, but you do have to wonder the practicality of the thing. Where did it go? Anyway. There's a cool shot there. The flag's on the left. Drogon's in the corner. The evil Empress is coming up. And before that shot, you see what I think is another kind of on-the-nose, wow, isn't this cool art school type photography, which is Dany coming out and Drogon starts launching from directly behind her, giving the impression that Dany has the dragon wings herself, which I equated while I was watching to that Maleficent movie with Angelina Jolie where she's got the wings and it's a whole thing. And yeah, I think Some people are going to like that. It's going to work for some people. At this point in time, after the Golden Hand, after the Tyrion walks, after Arya's inexplicable arrival, it was just another point where, yeah, the show put out what they think is a cool image. It just looked ridiculous to me. It looked like it was trying too hard, in all honesty. And maybe it was. Because there is a cool shot after this where Drogon's on either side. You got the flag. You got Jon walking up. And then Dany is just in full evil empress mode. She's speaking in the tongues of Essos, and she starts talking about the fact that they liberated King's Landing and they're going to liberate all the cities of the world. And as I put here in my notes, Dany has invented a new definition for liberate. And I think we're supposed to start thinking about her mindset here either as entirely crazy, and we'll talk about that in a second because she does have the crazy eyes for the Iron Throne, or we're supposed to start equating this with a kind of beneficent foreign policy in kind of real world terms about how countries feel about what they do in foreign lands in terms of liberating people and how that can be perceived when you're firebombing innocents with your giant dragon. And I think they're probably trying to get at some of that subtext, some of that contextual nuance of kind of real world politics by using the word liberate, kind of using language that you might hear out of United States foreign policy, some other countries' foreign policy. And it doesn't entirely work for me because they have constructed her to be so kind of evil in this framework. She looks evil. She's saying things that are essentially talking about continuous perpetual war. And obviously the story they are going to tell is that she needs to die for these things. So I'm not sure it's subtle enough. I'm not sure that's exactly what they're going for. I picked up on that a little bit. I might be bringing that to the party myself. But given the story that they're telling, I don't think it makes sense in any event. So Dany's speech here is just unclear. It's designed to sound kind of crazy because she has already won the war. She has King's Landing. She has the Seven Kingdoms. And what does it mean to liberate things like Winterfell when she talks about it in her speech? But I think she's supposed to be a little crazy. So it's very difficult to analyze from a kind of analytical perspective because we don't know exactly how mad we are supposed to be interpreting her. But in any event, after that speech, which I don't think most of our lead characters can understand, but they can get kind of the gist from the army pounding its staffs and the fact that Dany is using her angry voice, Tyrion comes up and basically says, hey, you murdered a whole city after Dany accuses him of freeing his brother Jaime. And she has him arrested for what amounts to treason, basically because he throws off the handspin and berates her, or at least talks down to her in front of everyone. More than, I think, releasing Jaime, because I do think that Jaime release, that whole plot line in the last episode didn't make a ton of sense to begin with. So I think it's a bunch of different things, but I think more than anything else, in the way the scene is framed, it's the fact that Tyrion disagrees with her actions, throws off the hand of the pin marking him as the hand of the queen, and I think that pisses Dany off, frankly. So being generous with the interpretation of that scene, because I don't think freeing Jaime really should have been enough to have any kind of major problems with Queen Dany, at least prior to her becoming the Mad Queen Dany. They move forward from there, and he's arrested, and then Jon and Arya have a conversation where Arya basically says, hey, she's crazy, bro. And Jon, you're going to be in trouble because she knows you're the only one with an equal or better claim to the throne than her. So she tries to put that idea in Jon's head. That's the first time we've seen Arya say something like that. It's Arya saying, Jon, you probably have to do something about Queen Dany. And then we have an interesting scene with Jon and Tyrion. Tyrion captured in one of what appears to be the few remaining full-sized rooms left in King's Landing after Dany and Drogon got done with it. And Jon talks to Tyrion about what happened. Now, the framework for this scene is interesting while I watched it because Jon needs a heck of a lot of convincing that what Dany did was evil. And I think being generous, you can look at this scene and say, Jon knows that Dany's evil. Jon says he can't explain what Dany did. He starts out there, but he doesn't seem willing to accuse her of bad faith, of bad acts. And Tyrion tries to tease out of him that he wouldn't have done the same thing, and he struggles with it. I think being generous to the scene, you could say, Jon's always been a man to honor his oaths, and he's Ned Stark's son, at least by being raised by Ned Stark. And so he wants to honor those oaths. He's sworn an oath to the queen, but he knows the right thing to do is to confront her and try to get her to stop doing what she's doing, and if that fails, to do something more drastic. And so he's fighting with that during this scene with Tyrion. It doesn't come across terribly well, I don't think, in the writing or in the acting particularly. But I think being generous, we can assume that's what's happening here, because otherwise Jon looks like a complete idiot. Jon is constantly fighting against Tyrion, trying to explain that what Dany did in King's Landing is evil. And they do a little bit of what feels like retconning. They anticipated that many people would have a problem with the way Dany just seemingly turned on a dime in the last episode. And so they start to talk through Tyrion about what they have shown over the previous seasons. And he describes the things that we had seen Dany do. Her killing of the people in Essos. Her killing of the Khals of the Dothraki. And how he describes it is he says, evil men die, and we cheer her for it. And I think that's right, and I think that's one of the problems people have with this turn and how unexpected it was. But I do think they're stealing a base there. They're right. Tyrion's right that she killed evil men. She was tyrannical towards those evil folks, and people cheered her for it. That's all right. But the show, which is meta-contextual, it's a level above what the characters themselves are experiencing, the show itself was fomenting those cheers from the real-world audience. In those scenes, you had her pose triumphantly. You had the triumphant music. You had it end seasons. You had it certainly end episodes, these victories, these moments where Dany, the chosen one, was saving slaves, was earning cities, was getting these accolades and getting these new names for herself. And so I think it's a little bit unfair to treat that as the answer for how this happened, why this happened, what could explain Dany's turn. Because Tyrion's ultimately making the point that when she gets cheered for these things, when it is this victorious moment, she begins to believe all of her press, essentially. And when she believes that she's building a better world, as she gains power, she believes it more and more. And then she believes that she has to kill anyone that would act against her because she's the savior. She has a messianic complex. And that all makes sense, except for the fact that Tyrion should have known these things if that was going to be a problem earlier than now. And it came out of nowhere because Varys and Tyrion just started talking about her doing crazy things really before she did any crazy things. And so there should have been more lead up. There should have been more build up to that. But outside of that, it feels like the show was kind of cheating because of the way it presented her victories to the people that were watching it. And so I am totally on board with people being mad about Dany turning, flipping on a switch, and becoming this evil queen because the show presented her as victorious. The show presented her as this conquering hero. And it never went away from that until she burned down King's Landing. And maybe that's okay. Maybe that's subverting expectations. Maybe that story beat works for you. It didn't work for me, and I can see online it didn't work for a number of other people. And I think if you're analyzing why that is, it's because the show essentially cheated on this stuff. It didn't give any indication that what it was showing wasn't these victorious circumstances, but was in fact hinting at a deeper megalomania or a problem with this kind of messianic complex. You get a little bit about Dany being a very strong leader and putting down other people and saying bend the knee and things like that, but nothing on this level that would suggest in episode 5 of the last season of the show, one episode before the finale, and really the last significant acts that Dany would do, because she doesn't get a lot to do in this episode. When we discuss the next scene, she'll already be dead. That nothing hinted that that would happen, that it would happen in that way, and that she would kill innocents for no reason other than to kill them. And so I do think those people have a point, and I think the show is trying to cheat just a little bit by putting in Tyrion's mouth this concept. And I think it's an interesting one. I think it's a good one. You can see how that story could work. I don't think it was the story we were told. And that, more than anything else, in this episode kind of gives you that hurt feeling in your gut. you can see a good story. And it makes sense because George R. R. Martin has probably thought through a lot of these implications when he gave them the goalposts, when he gave them the bullet points that they would hit at the end of the season. You can see how they could get there, but they didn't get there. And that, in some ways, is more painful than the alternative, where this cool story doesn't exist at all. There's a cool story here, but they didn't get there, and that's what hurts the most. So Tyrion ultimately, you feel, kind of convinces him that he's probably going to have to do something about Dany. It's a good scene. It's an interesting scene. Tyrion is clearly trying to convince Jon to do something, and then Jon goes to meet with Dany. You get a cool scene with Drogon outside where he essentially approves of Jon going in. And then you get Dany touching the Iron Throne, and she's gone back into the full kind of crazy eyes stance that you saw her wield a little bit at the end of the last episode, or in the middle of the last episode, the last time you got to see her. And she starts to look a little crazy. Then she hears Jon come into the room, and she starts talking about her beliefs as a little girl. She's clearly happy. She's clearly trying to connect with Jon, and Jon immediately shuts that down. And he's much angrier with Dany than he ever was with Tyrion. And you have to try to figure out why that might be, that he has been convinced by Tyrion's argument that something needs to be done with Dany, that he's more comfortable being angry with Dany than he is with Tyrion, which doesn't make a ton of sense. But either way, he has moved forward, and he's starting to tell Dany what his problems with her are. The fact that Grey Worm is outside murdering Lannisters in cold blood that have already surrendered. And then we get a conversation that I want to read essentially verbatim because it is the crux of this scene. It's the crux of why Jon winds up killing Dany. I'm also going to read to you a segment from another movie and talk about how they're the same. And then I'm going to talk about why the scene in Game of Thrones doesn't work as well as this other movie. This other movie, which is widely criticized for its lack of nuance in writing and some other problems that people have with it. You'll recognize it as soon as I get to it. But I felt this was important. It's immediately what came to mind while I was watching this scene. And it does kind of talk about some of the systemic structural issues that the show has at this point in the series. So here's the conversation they have. I think it's an important one. And I think it's interesting what they're talking about, but it just doesn't make sense in this world. So it says, it's not easy to see something that's never been before. This is Dany talking to Jon. Jon is concerned about Dany's activities. And he says, a good world. How do you know? How do you know it'll be good? Because I know what is good, and so do you. Jon says, I don't. She says, you do. You do. You've always known. And he says, what about everyone else? All the other people who think they know what's good. And she says, they don't get to choose. It's interesting because she's demonstrating that she knows what is good. She knows what is better. She is the arbiter of righteousness. And that goes to that megalomania. That goes to that messianic complex. Let's talk about the other sequence from this movie. I don't think the system works. How would you have it work? We need a system where the politicians sit down and discuss the problem, agree what's in the best interest of all the people, and then do it. Well, that's exactly what we do. The trouble is that people don't always agree. Well, then they should be made to. Well, who's going to make them? Someone wise. Sounds an awful lot like a dictatorship to me. And that's from, of course, Attack of the Clones, the much-lauded Episode 2 of the Star Wars saga, which I bring up because we are going to have some thoughts about Benioff and Weiss taking over the reins of Star Wars for the next Star Wars movie. But in looking at those two sequences, they are expressing the same idea. In the mouths of Anakin, he's saying, well, people should be made to do what is right. And Padme rightly says, well, who's going to make them? We have a democracy. And he says, someone wise. And she says, that's a dictatorship. And she's right. That's a dictatorship when you say, hey, someone's going to explain what is good and righteous, and that's exactly what it will be. And here we have, in Game of Thrones, Dany espousing those same thoughts, the Anakin thoughts that says, hey, I get to choose what is right and what is wrong. The other people who think they know what is good, they don't matter. And this is presented as the final moment where Jon decides that he has to kill Dany because Dany is making these choices without thinking about other people and just doing what she thinks is right, and that's it. But the problem is, unlike Star Wars, where in Attack of the Clones, you've got an existing democracy, and George Lucas is trying to establish that Anakin has got a screw loose, and he is trying to espouse for what will ultimately be an empire. but is just espousing a dictatorship while he's talking to Padme. And this is a bad thing. Having someone impose what is good versus what is wrong on other people is a bad thing. But that's a change away from democracy. In the world of Game of Thrones, and this is going to come up later in the episode, we don't have a democracy. We have a king or a queen that is leading all the people, and honest to God, is deciding what is good and what is evil and what is right and what is wrong. So the fact that Dany is taking that up, is making that leadership choice, isn't this massive shift away from the existing political structure that it is in Star Wars. This feels like a conversation that is lifted entirely from either the modern world, from something like Star Wars, or just something that Benioff and Weiss had heard that they liked before. It does speak to our modern sensibilities that what she is saying is wrong, that no one person should get to choose what is right or wrong, what is good or evil. But the fact of the matter remains, the world of Westeros, the world of Game of Thrones, is not our world. And what she is saying is exactly what a king or queen is going to do. It's exactly what Bran is going to wind up doing when he is put in that role as king for life. He is going to determine the direction of the realm and what is right and what is wrong and what the laws are. And so this doesn't seem like the right point for Jon to decide that he needs to kill Dany, although it was interesting in the moment. And so I think it does represent one of the fundamental flaws of Game of Thrones, certainly in these last 2 seasons, which is they do stuff because it feels right, because it looks cool, because it has a Michael Bay action element, because it talks to their modern sensibilities, but not because it is motivated by the characters in the scene, not because it makes sense within the world of Westeros, whether that's because of the resources or the Night King and the way the White Walkers work, because it's politics like this. They don't care about the details, and that winds up permeating the entire storytelling structure. And so this conversation jumped out at me as something that I really wanted to dive into. Thank you for going along this trip with me. We're going to get back to Attack of the Clones at the end of this video because Benioff and Weiss are taking over Star Wars, and I do have a few thoughts on that when we get to the end. After this conversation, as I said, this is the last real beat that Dany winds up having. And then Jon kills her, stabs her with the dagger, and that's the end of Dany. That's the last we get of Dany. That's 8 seasons of development, of watching this young girl grow up, go through all these trials and tribulations, free these slave cities, do all this. She turns, and half an episode later, she's dead. And that's the story of Game of Thrones from the perspective of Dany. And I have to say, that's about as disappointing as it could possibly be. There's not an arc, there's not a message, there's not a story in what Dany did. And I think if you're a fan of Daenerys, if you're a fan of what she's done, of the way she was presented as triumphant, of freeing the slaves, of growing from slavery, in essence, to this powerful female leader, you have every right to be upset about, to be disappointed about how she was treated. And to give her really no greater arc in this series finale just leaves her dead and with nothing else to say about her. And that's really sad. And I feel for those people that had Dany as a favorite character because she didn't get what she deserved. After Jon kills her, Drogon appears, as you would expect. And one of the things I had always wondered while I was thinking about how this episode would proceed was how anybody would handle Drogon. And the answer is nobody really does. Drogon shows up. It looks like he might eat or set fire to Jon, and he just doesn't. He winds up setting fire to the Iron Throne and melting it, which is the next kind of on-the-nose set of imagery. It makes sense from a poetic standpoint. The wheel is broken, Dany has come, the throne is melted. I mentioned in my analysis of episode 5 that I thought that episode would end on a picture of the melting throne because it made too much sense for what was happening. Instead, they moved that out to here. They have Drogon melt it. The only problem I have with it is it doesn't make a ton of sense to me. Drogon's a dragon. What is he thinking in that moment? What's his motivation? I don't know. He decides not to kill Jon, and he instead burns the Iron Throne. Is that because that was what Dany was seeking and it ultimately killed her? Is he just an animal? We'll never know. He doesn't get a perspective chapter, I wouldn't think, in A Song of Ice and Fire, and that's how it's presented in the television show. Makes for a cool image. He then takes Dany and flies away, and that's the last we see of either of them. Then we cut to what amounts to the epilogue. We cut to weeks or months later. We have Tyrion reference that he has been thinking about what has happened while he was imprisoned for weeks when he talks about it in his discussion. we get Tyrion walking up to what amounts to the Council of the Elders, the Lords and Ladies of Westeros. And this is about another 2 minutes. So for those of you keeping track at home, we've got 10 plus minutes in this episode of Tyrion walking. Either lightly scored or not scored at all for the earliest walk, because it's trying to show the eeriness of King's Landing after Dany and Drogon got done with it. But we do have what amounts to at least 10 minutes of Tyrion basically walking from location to location. And the location that he's brought to in this scene is the Dragon Pit, from where they met with Cersei at the end of Season 7 to show her the White. And in this scene, we see the leaders, the Lords and Ladies of Westeros, in the various seats that they have been granted. So we see Gendry, we see Robin Arryn, we see some other kind of no-name people. We also see Ed Martelli, who's going to pop up as we discuss this scene. And we have Grey Worm bringing Tyrion to this Council of Lords and Ladies to determine Tyrion's fate, it would seem. And we have Jon Snow not coming along. We have Jon Snow announced as having been captured by Grey Worm some weeks or months ago. But he's not brought along because they're still deciding what his fate is going to be. Sansa and Arya want him freed. Grey Worm's not willing to free him. And Yara pipes in and is upset with this state of affairs and says the Unsullied and Grey Worm should be allowed to do what they want with Jon Snow, because the Ironborn, Yara's Ironborn at least, had pledged their loyalty to Daenerys. And it's interesting here because my recollection had been that the Iron Islands, through Yara, had agreed to their independence for helping get Dany across the ocean, but that never comes up in this conversation. They actually talk through Yara about having pledged to Dany, but not what the cost of their pledging their loyalty to Dany was, which is interesting only because how this scene goes, that there is some kingdom that goes independent, which we'll talk about, but Yara never brings it up, and so that's a little bit of an odd oversight, but it's the exact kind of odd oversight that has become endemic in this last couple seasons of Game of Thrones. The actual small details that used to be the fun part of theorizing and thinking about what was happening in Westeros and Essos, that has just gone by the wayside. The little details don't matter that much. So at the end of this, Davos offers the Reach. Grey Worm rejects the offer, says Jon Snow can't go free, and they ultimately decide that in order to figure out what's going to happen to Jon and to Tyrion, they need to choose a king. Ed Martelli, who has been not present in the show for some number of seasons, and I believe is Lord of Riverrun at this point in time, starts to claim the throne, starts to espouse his virtues, why they should consider him king, and is told to sit down. Looks like an idiot. Sam then gets up, talks about potentially having democracy be the way Westeros chooses a king. This is immediately laughed at. I didn't really understand this beat, other than perhaps that folks would expect that democracy might be up on the table for consideration by these folks, and they wanted to talk about how it would be received by the lords and ladies at this time in Westerosi history. So they have Sam bring it up. He's immediately laughed at and shot down. And then Tyrion gets a big, long speech. Now, there's a couple of things that happen here. The first of which is he gets a long speech to start talking about who should be nominated for king. And it's interesting because the framework of the scene is that Grey Worm doesn't want Tyrion to get any rights. He wants him tried, potentially convicted, potentially killed. And so the fact that Tyrion winds up giving this long speech winds up feeling a little weird, a little artificial, because Grey Worm basically lets him do it. Now, we talked at the beginning of this video about the problems that I have with Grey Worm in general. I don't think that this scene makes a lot of sense, because I don't think the scenario that Grey Worm has captured Tyrion and Jon Snow, and that's just okay with the rest of Westeros, is okay. I think Grey Worm should be treated basically the same as Dany, and should be the same kind of war criminal Dany was, and he shouldn't be getting this kind of consideration from these noble families. But it's not up to me. They accept that Grey Worm has them in this position, presumably because of kind of real politic between the two armies that's kind of hinted at in the scene. But Grey Worm is allowed to do this. However, he doesn't much care about Tyrion giving this long speech. And the premise of Tyrion's speech, as he begins his nomination process for Bran, is there's nothing in the world more powerful than a good story. Now, every single time I see phrases and setups like this in a television show, in a movie, I always think about how self-serving it is, that this was a written story and they are talking about the glory and the goodness of stories. Now, as I say that, as I say how self-aggrandizing it is and how ridiculous I think it is, particularly for this story, particularly for a story that has come off the rails and where characters don't make any sense and plot lines don't make any sense and scenarios don't make any sense, I will say I agree with the sentiment. I have always felt that stories are the way humanity bonds, the way humanity talks about its shared experiences, how people learn, how we discuss morality in frameworks that children can understand, that adults can understand when they haven't faced the same moral quandaries that other people have, how we learn. And so I really, truly agree with the sentiment that a good story is one of the most fantastic binding things in the universe. But it's absolutely ridiculous as the premise for electing a king, and it's ridiculous in particular for Tyrion to have it and to espouse it in this context, where you've got the story of Bran, sure, where he went out and became a crazy psychic boy, but you've also got, sitting in prison, the story of the prince who was promised, the son of ice and fire, the Targaryen Stark, who has led the peoples to victories over the Night King and the White Walkers, who saved the realm from a tyrannical queen, who is Jon Snow, who has by far the more compelling story than Bran the Broken, as is his title given to him by Tyrion. And so I think just in the premise alone, the writers had to come up with a way that Tyrion could espouse the virtues of Bran over the virtues of Jon and some other people. And they came up with this story concept, but really that couldn't be more self-aggrandizing. They're essentially saying what a good story they told with Bran, who, by the way, took an entire season off because they had so little story to tell with him. But that they did such a good job telling his story that that story alone was powerful enough to make the lords and ladies of Westeros vote for him to be their king. And so Tyrion espouses that the lords and ladies should vote for their king. They say Bran won't be able to have issue. He can't have children. And Tyrion says, that's great. We don't want to have lineage determine our leadership. But in this particular story, problematic lineage is exactly what caused the War of the Five Kings, is exactly what caused the succeeding wars after the War of the Five Kings. Problematic lineage is why these houses fight, is why these kingdoms don't get along. The smooth transition of power across lineage was basically the only thing that was starting or that was keeping the houses at bay to some extent. And when that lineage was questioned, when it turned out that some folks believed, rightly, that the children of Robert Baratheon were actually the children of Jaime and Cersei Lannister, that was when all the trouble started. This is a terrible, terrible system for the Kingdom of Westeros. I'm not saying it's a terrible system in general, but for this story that we were being told, it's a terrible idea. And so we can strongly expect that when Bran dies, the next successor council, if there is any single non-I vote, will have a problem. You actually see it a little bit in this very episode, because what happens is they call for the votes and all the lords and ladies say aye, except for Sansa. And what does Sansa do? She essentially says, I'm not voting. The North is declaring its independence. I'm going to be Queen of the North. Bran says that's fine. He doesn't care about anything. He's going to be a heck of a king, by the way. He's going to only speak in bromides of kind of fortune telling. And it's really going to be an interesting thing to see him try to adjudicate something like a stolen sheep dispute by only talking about how beautiful the sheep was when it was stolen, or talking about the farmer's wife's birthday photos, or whatever it is that he's thinking about in his wheelchair and psychic head. That's going to be really interesting on a day-to-day basis, but I guess we're not going to get that show. But overall, having this concept of voting for your next king or queen is interesting, but it doesn't fundamentally work with what we have seen of the houses, of how the kingdoms interact and operate in Westeros. And frankly, I view it in the same lens as politicians in our modern day kicking the can down the road to someone later. Okay, maybe we can get years of peace while Bran the Psychic Boy rolls around in his wheelchair and does weird things as king of the 6 kingdoms, but whenever he dies, that'll be somebody else's problem. And if there's anybody that votes no or declares independence, well, that's going to be a war. This process basically requires unanimous approval. I'm in the business of making corporations and limited liability companies. One of the very first things we discuss when we're making those companies is, how does management work? How do votes work? If there's a limited number of you, what happens when someone disagrees? If there's an even number of you, what happens when there's a tie? And none of this is sorted out in this scene. And I'm not saying sitting there and talking about the details of how something like this would work for 40 minutes makes for interesting television, but I would have at least liked to see some kind of hand-waving explanation for how this might work in the real world, and in particular, the real world of Westeros. And so that's my real problem with this kind of concept. My secondary problem, of course, is Bran becoming king seems like the worst possible king. He's the strange psychic boy in a wheelchair. He doesn't exactly project power. As he said himself, he doesn't have any wants. He accepts the throne by saying, "Why do you think I came all this way?" But it doesn't make any sense for what we've been shown of his plot line. It doesn't really make sense for anything that he was told by the Three-Eyed Raven about being in a position where he's going to rule Westeros. But I can accept that maybe some of that was lost in translation. Maybe there are some little hidden gems throughout the seasons that would suggest that this is a proper role for him. But I didn't see it while I watched. And I'll be interested to see if anybody in my comments or elsewhere on the internet says exactly why Bran is a good choice to lead the kingdoms. To me, this feels like the show has stopped, that this is a natural place for it to stop, but that the problems that were the War of the Five Kings are going to continue, because at least the houses that have any army whatsoever are going to have problems with the little wheelchaired Stark boy who speaks in riddles trying to command the six kingdoms of Westeros. So it's an interesting choice. I think it was one of two that really was left to them between Bran and Sansa, but it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Then we get to the real problems. So Jon gets exiled, and I really think this wound up feeling like a bad result for him. And I don't think it necessarily had to be. I would have liked to have seen Jon given agency here. I would have liked to have seen Tyrion come up to him in the prison cell and basically been like, "Look, Sansa won't let anything bad happen to you, but Grey Worm won't let you go. We can't figure this out. We don't know what to do with you." And for Jon to essentially come up and say, "Hey, look, I never wanted the throne," as he expressed in at least half of his lines this season, "but I feel like I was my best version when I was Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. I would like to guard the realms of men. I would like to be that shield. Let me be exiled. Let me have that life sentence. Let Grey Worm accept that life sentence. Let Sansa accept that I'm alive. And I can do that for the kingdoms. I'm willing to do that. And I can find my peace there. I can find my place in this world there." And to give Jon that agency, he has done enough. He has done enough throughout the series to get that agency. Instead, it is forced upon him. And we never get a scene where it looks like he's particularly happy with that circumstance. Now, Jon always looks a little bit dour. It's just the way he is. But he never looks particularly satisfied with that. He does give his doggo a pet up north at some point. But I think overall, the overall feeling I have for his end result is that he got the short end of the stick. Because Bran made Tyrion the hand of the king. Jon gets exiled for doing what Arya told him to do, for doing what Tyrion told him to do, for saving the realms of Westeros and maybe more of the world from liberation by the Mad Queen and her dragon. And what does he get for it? He gets sent up to the Arctic, where at least in the way the show has presented it, he doesn't get any kind of satisfactory resolution whatsoever. Meanwhile, Grey Worm just leaves. He's going to leave on a boat. He's going to go off to visit the islands where Missandei was born. And that's it. That's it for him. He's a war criminal. He murdered people in the streets of King's Landing, and he's just let go. No problems, no questions asked. Again, this is, as I talked about at the top of this video, a bad actor getting a good result, while Jon is a good actor and gets a bad result. And hey, maybe that's Game of Thrones. Maybe that's George R.R. Martin. It doesn't mean it has to be satisfying. That might subvert all the expectations that you want, but it doesn't mean it has to be satisfying. And for me personally, I didn't find it satisfying at all. Then you got Jon saying goodbye to the various Starks, at which point it's revealed that Arya is not going back up north, despite the fact that she called herself the last of the Starks and how important family was not 2 episodes ago. She's going to go wherever west is, whatever is to the west that nobody knows about. She's going to go exploring. She's been an assassin. She's been an orphan type person. She's been a miscreant, and now she's going to go be an explorer. And that's Arya's story, apparently. And again, I found that arc to be unsatisfying. Then you get a real kick in the bum when you get Brienne's arc, who winds up looking over the Jaime's book, the Book of the Kingsguard, where they talk about the acts of bravery or other acts that the Kingsguard have undertaken, and she decides to fill in Jaime's pages. And she adds all the stuff that Jaime did. It's very weird. It's not at all reactive to what Brienne's arc is. It's reactive to what Jaime's is. And then in the most saccharine possible, ridiculous, on-the-nose kind of ending shot, she puts as the last line for Jaime Lannister that he died protecting his queen. Now, I talked at the end of my analysis in episode 5 about how repulsive I found what they did to the Jaime plotline. This made it triply more so. This is absolutely ridiculous. I don't know that it shows some kind of Stockholm or Nightingale syndrome that Brienne has towards Jaime, that she allowed him to knight her, to take her to bed, to leave her for Cersei, and then she gives him this wonderfully glowing set of descriptions of events and died protecting his queen. Now, anybody who's looking at this book and can put two and two together can realize it's Cersei Lannister, who at the time was a crazy mad tyrant of her own, but still, it's triacally, it is saccharine, it is ridiculous. And it's another scene in this episode that is so on the nose, and it just makes you kind of gag and or laugh at it while you're watching. The next scene we get is the small council fan fiction scene where we see Bronn as the Master of Coin, Tyrion's the Hand, Sam is the Grand Maester, although I'm not sure we ever saw him really graduate or do anything in Old Town that would suggest that he would be able to ascend to this role. We have him introduce the book, A Song of Ice and Fire, as written by the folks in Old Town and presented to Tyrion. It's played off as a joke. It's, again, one of those scenes that you expect in a kind of sitcom where you've got the characters writing a book about their travails. It speaks a little bit to what Tolkien was doing with The Hobbit, that Bilbo Baggins was writing about his adventures, but it's just played off as a joke that Tyrion isn't mentioned in the story. It's a weird joke because it's hard to believe that Tyrion wouldn't make an appearance or two in the entirety of Song of Ice and Fire, unless maybe the Maesters were sticking solely to the White Walkers plotline and then just ended it anticlimactically in like one chapter at the end of the book. We also get Davos Master of Ships with other roles to be filled and a reference to the fact that Drogon is still missing, but maybe Bran can find him another time because he's a mystical psychic king boy. And then we get some kind of dialogue about Bronn being silly and wanting brothels and a bunch of other stuff that really, really, really felt like fan fiction about these various characters in these roles. And to me, was entirely unnecessary. You even get the camera pan back slowly as they're talking right out of a sitcom or right out of Sam Malone turning off the lights in the bar on Cheers. And then finally, the very last thing you get in the episode is the Stark montage where you see Arya take the boat to the west. You see Sansa get dressed to rule as queen in the north. And you see Jon get to the wall, pet his doggo Ghost, and then seemingly immediately violate his Night's Watch vows and go north of the wall with the wildlings. It's unclear what's happening in that scene because Jon has been shown to be so honorable, because he was shown earlier in the episode as struggling with his oath to Daenerys and knowing what must be done, that he arrives at the wall and immediately goes north with the wildlings. So that's unclear. Maybe he's helping them get settled up there. In terms of timing, it's unclear what the wildlings are even doing at Castle Black or whatever other castle they are on at the wall, because 2 episodes ago in episode 4, we were told that Tormund and Ghost were going to go north immediately, but apparently the wildlings didn't do that. Given the fact that Jon then marches south and then gets imprisoned for at least a couple weeks and maybe a month or two, and then comes back north, the fact that Tormund and the wildlings are still waiting to be led north by Jon as either the new Lord Commander or just a Night's Watchman is unclear. But again, I think this is, and it's fitting for the last shot of the show, another instance where logic and the structure of what has happened don't matter as much to Benioff and Weiss as the imagery. They wanted to have Jon walking north with the wildlings. They wanted to have the door in the wall close behind him and him leading them into the forests north of the wall. For what reason? We don't know, because we don't get any motivation for what Jon's doing in that scene. We don't really get any thoughts about how he feels to be back at the Night's Watch, back on the wall. We don't get any reason for why the Night's Watch exists. It had certainly been implied that the Night's Watch was there to prevent the White Walkers from getting back south of the wall. Obviously, they failed. There's a giant hole in the wall right now, but also the White Walkers are dead, as best we can tell. And I think as part of the agency that I had talked about, Jon being owed for deciding to go back to the Night's Watch, it also would have been nice for at least maybe Psychic Bran to mention that it was still worthwhile to have a Night's Watch, to still be watching for mystical threats from the north, because otherwise it looks completely unnecessary as a form of exile. And so that's where the show leaves us. That's where the show ends. And that's where I looked at the credits and said, yeah, that felt like a waste of time. That felt like a waste of time for years and years and years. And unfortunately, that's the way I feel about it. I like to have my postmortems be constructive. I like to have them be positive. I like to talk about narrative structure, what I liked and what I didn't like. And at the end of the day, Game of Thrones feels like a waste of time. It feels like a wasted opportunity, because you really had craftsmen at the top of their craft. You had actors at the top of their craft. You had a wonderful musical score with a composer at the top of his craft. You had a written work that was made by a novelist at the top of his craft and was interpreted for many years by writers that really seemed to be at the top of their craft. And all of that went by the wayside at the end of the day, because they didn't know how to stick the landing. They didn't care about the details. And the overriding feeling of these last two seasons is kind of an overriding sense of laziness on the part of the plotters, on the part of the showrunners and the writers, that they didn't care about details. They didn't care about people warping around the continent. They didn't care about how a war would be conducted. They didn't care about the structure that the series had led to with respect to the White Walkers and the others. They didn't care about the structure, the characterization of Daenerys Stormborn and her turn that would be pivotal to the ending sequences of Game of Thrones. They didn't care enough about any of those things. And the people that did care, the audience, the fans, the people that had made Game of Thrones the most popular thing on the planet for a very short time, were just left in the lurch. They were the ones that experienced the pain, because Benioff and Weiss aren't experiencing any pain. They're getting the reins to Star Wars, and they're beginning their treatment on Star Wars tomorrow, for all we know, if they haven't started already. And so that lack of care, that lack of attention to detail, it ultimately just winds up hurting the fans, the people that were most invested in the story, that were the biggest supporters of what Game of Thrones was. And I think the biggest winner out of all this is really George R.R. Martin. There was a point in time halfway through this series where it looked like George R.R. Martin was going to be passed by Benioff and Weiss, and that people would ultimately turn to the Game of Thrones TV show for what the definitive version of A Song of Ice and Fire was, and he was going to be left in the lurch. And maybe we would never get those books at all, because nobody would be interested in seeing an ending that was already depicted on TV. And I think the winner is George R.R. Martin, because Season 7 and Season 8 so botched the landing, so messed up the plot points of what A Song of Ice and Fire was to be, that I think George R.R. Martin right now can only look like a hero if Winds of Winter is anything close to worth reading. And I suspect it will be. I think he knows that that position has shifted for him, and it would surprise me now if at least Winds of Winter didn't come out in the next couple years. I think maybe we never get A Dream of Spring. I don't know. But I think George R.R. Martin probably has a good sense that he will look like a hero to a number of people that are interested in this story if he gets that book out in the relative close aftermath of what has become a real debacle for television and for HBO. Looking at the trailers for the HBO shows at the beginning of this episode, this series finale of Game of Thrones, I didn't have anything else that I wanted to watch on the channel. I will be canceling it at the end of Game of Thrones, like I'm sure so many others will be. And I think ultimately this show winds up tarnishing their legacy. HBO lives on a premium subscriber model. They live on being better than normal television. And this felt like it sunk below broadcast television at the end of this. And that's a real shame. So at the end of the day, Bran is king. Jon killed Dany as we expected. He's exiled north of the Wall, or at least to the Night's Watch. Tyrion is Hand of the King, seemingly in the same place he's been at in almost every season of the show. He's various Hands of the King in various capacities throughout the show, and he's back despite all the mistakes that he's made, despite everything else that he's done, he essentially moved in stasis. So if you were a big Tyrion fan, you got no interesting, clever remarks for the last 3 or 4 years, and he wound up exactly where you left him. Grey Worm decides to go south because nobody cares that he's a murderer and worked with Dany to murder the people of King's Landing. Arya goes west for no reason other than the fact that they didn't have a good plotline for her, and Sansa declares herself the Queen of Winterfell, takes that role, and that's all she really ever wanted, and that's the end of most of the main characters of Game of Thrones. So that's really the end of my postmortem analysis. The last little bit of things that I wanted to talk about was the fact that, hey, I've complained about Benioff and Weiss being the new writers on Star Wars, but looking at what they did here in Game of Thrones, maybe I was being too harsh because, in fact, I think they really nailed the Star Wars vibe of the prequels. They are writing at pretty much prequels level. I like the plot line of the prequels better than I like the plot line of Game of Thrones, but if you look at Dany's turn in the last episode and how little foreshadowing, how little character development they did to lead up to that moment, it very much matches Anakin's turn in Revenge of the Sith. And if you look at the dialogue today, where they're talking about essentially the problems with dictatorship and with one person choosing what's right and wrong, in essence, the notion of monarchy, then you get a very similar mirror image to that language you saw in Attack of the Clones, which I believe is the lowest rated Star Wars. And a lot of that has to do with the dialogue, which is lifted in part for this episode, this series finale, this pinnacle moment of their keystone show in the final moments of one of the main characters. And so, hey, maybe I was being too harsh on them. They certainly have the ability to put some cool imagery on screen, whether or not it makes sense. They have some ability to make wooden dialogue to put in characters' mouths, whether their characterization or plot makes sense. And they can do a turn from good to evil just as nonsensically as George Lucas ever did. So, hey, guys, Star Wars is your baby. You can do it just as good as the prequels, and we'll be eager to see it just as eager as we are to rewatch Attack of the Clones. So that's the end of my postmortem analysis for Game of Thrones, Episode 6, The Iron Throne. I apologize for this being so negative. I apologize for this running as long as it did. But frankly, I wanted to vent a little bit about this because I think these writers, these showrunners, they took for granted what the fandom was for this show. They took advantage of the good feelings that people had for Game of Thrones, for A Song of Ice and Fire, and by taking advantage of people in that way, I really lost a great deal of respect for the product that they put out this season, last season, and even the seasons that they put out before things really went badly. I'll be interested to see what they do with Star Wars, but I'm not holding out hope, regardless of my sarcastic comments just now. And that's it for Game of Thrones. Later on, I might wind up doing a post-mortem coverage of the entire series to talk about the overall thoughts, but I think I did that to some extent in this episode post-mortem itself. Otherwise, if you're interested in anything else on this channel, please check it out. I do a regular show called Virtual Legality that talks about the business and law of information technology and video games and some cool stuff like that. I recently did a page turn of a recent Supreme Court case that talked about whether or not Apple can be sued by its customers for things that are sold on the App Store. Some interesting stuff there. Otherwise, if you like this video, please do like, please subscribe, please share it with anyone and everyone you think would be interested in these conversation pieces, that's interested in Game of Thrones, wants to have these conversations. I love having conversations with new people. If you think I'm an idiot, tell me about it in the comments. If you think I'm great and I've just nailed it completely, tell me about that in the comments as well. I don't care either way, right or wrong. I love to have those conversations. Otherwise, if you watch this on YouTube, thank you so much for watching and for sticking with me through this entire postmortem series for Game of Thrones. If you listen to this on a podcast, thank you so much for listening. Please review this series. Please review Virtual Legality as a whole on the podcast service that you're listening to this on. I very much appreciate it, and I will catch you the very next time I see you on the Hoeg Law YouTube channel. Thanks again.